Chapter 6. Castle Araluen, the seat of King Duncan's rule, was a building of majestic beauty. The tall, spire-topped towers and soaring buttresses had an almost lifelike grace to them that belied the strength and solidity of the castle. It was beautiful, surely enough, built in huge blocks of honey-coloured hardstone, but it was almost impregnable as well. The many high towers gave the castle a sense of light and air and gracefulness, but they also provided the inhabitants with a score of positions from which to pour arrows, rocks, and boiling oil on any attackers who might be unwise enough to assault the walls. The throne room was the heart of the castle, situated inside a series of walls and portcullises and drawbridges, which, in the event of a prolonged siege, provided defenders with a succession of fallback positions. Like everything else about the castle, the throne room was vast in scale, with a vaulted ceiling that towered high above, and a paved floor finished in black and dull pink marble squares. The tall windows were glazed with stained glass that glowed brilliantly in the low-angle sunshine of winter. The columns that added immense strength to the walls were grouped and fluted to heighten the illusion of lightness and space in the room. Duncan's throne, a simple affair carved from oak, surmounted with a carving of an oak leaf, dominated the northern wall. At the opposite end, wooden benches and tables were provided for the members of Duncan's cabinet. In between, the room was bare, with room for several hundred courtiers to stand. On ceremonial occasions, they would throng the area, their brightly coloured clothes and coats of arms catching the red, blue, gold, and orange light that spilled through the stained glass windows, sending highlights sparkling from their polished armour and helmets. Today, by Duncan's command, there were barely a dozen people present, the minimum number required by law to see justice dispensed. The king faced the task before him with little pleasure, and he wanted as few witnesses as possible present to see what he knew he would have to do. He sat, frowning heavily, on the throne, facing straight ahead, his eyes locked on the towering double doors at the other end of the room. His massive broadsword, its pommel carved with the leopard's head that was Duncan's personal insignia, rested in its scabbard, leaning against the right-hand arm of the throne. Lord Anthony of Spa, Duncan's chamberlain for the past 15 years, stood to one side of the throne and several steps below it. He looked meaningfully at the king now, and cleared his throat apologetically to attract the monarch's attention. Duncan's blue eyes swiveled to him, the eyebrows raised in an unspoken question, and the chamberlain nodded. "It's time, Your Majesty," he said quietly. Short and overweight, Lord Anthony was no warrior. He had no skill at arms at all, and, as a consequence, his muscles were soft and untrained. His value was as an administrator. Largely due to his help, the kingdom of Araluen had long been a prosperous and contented realm. Duncan was a popular king, and a just one, which wasn't to say that he wasn't a strong ruler, willing and committed to enforcing the laws of the realm, laws that had been laid down and maintained by his predecessors going back 600 years. And there lay the reason for Duncan's frown and his heavy heart. Because today he would have to enforce one of those laws on a man who had been his friend and loyal servant. A man, in fact, to whom Duncan owed everything. A man who twice in the past 2 decades had been instrumental in saving Araluen from the dark threat of defeat and enslavement at the hands of a madman. Lord Anthony shifted restlessly. Duncan saw the movement and waved one hand in a defeated gesture. "Very well," he said. "Let's have done with this business." Anthony turned to face the throne room. The few people gathered there stirred at the movement, looking expectantly towards the doors. The chamberlain's symbol of office was a long ebony staff shod in steel. He raised it now and brought it down twice on the flagstone floors. The ringing crack of steel on stone echoed through the room, carrying clearly to the men who waited beyond the closed doors. There was a slight pause, then the doors swung open, almost soundless on their well-oiled, perfectly balanced hinges. As they came to a stop, a small party of men entered, proceeding at ceremonial slow march pace to stand at the base of the wide steps leading up to the throne. There were 4 men all told. 3 of them wore the surcoats, mail, and helmets of the King's Watch. The 4th was a small figure, clad in nondescript green and dull grey clothes. He was bareheaded, and his hair was a pepper and salt grey, shaggy and badly cut. He marched between the 2 leading men of his guard, the 3rd bringing up the rear directly behind him. The small man's face was matted with dried blood, Duncan saw, and there was an ugly bruise on his upper left cheek that all but closed the eye above it. "Halt," he said, before he could stop himself. "Are you all right?" Holt's gaze rose now to meet his. For a brief moment, Duncan thought he saw an unfathomable depth of sadness there. Then the moment was gone, and there was nothing in those dark eyes but fierce resolve and a hint of mockery. "I'm as well as can be expected, Your Majesty," he said dryly. Lord Anthony reacted as if stung by a wasp. "Hold your tongue, prisoner," he snapped. At his words, the corporal standing beside Holt raised one hand to strike the prisoner. But before the blow could be launched, Duncan half rose from his throne. "That's enough!" His voice cracked out in the near-empty room. The corporal lowered his hand, a little shamefaced. It occurred to Duncan that nobody present was enjoying this scene. Holt was too well known and too well respected a figure in the kingdom. He hesitated, knowing what he must do next, but hating to do it. "Shall I read the charges, Your Majesty?" Lord Anthony asked. It was actually up to Duncan to tell him to do that. Instead, the king waved one hand in reluctant acquiescence. Yes, go ahead if you must," he muttered, then regretted it as Anthony looked at him, a wounded expression on his face. After all, Duncan realized, Anthony didn't want to do this either. Duncan shrugged apologetically. "I'm sorry, Lord Anthony. Please, read the charges." Anthony cleared his throat uncomfortably at that. It was bad enough that the king had abandoned the formal procedure, but infinitely more embarrassing to the chamberlain was the fact that the king now saw fit to apologize to him. "The prisoner Holt, a ranger in your majesty's forces, carrying the king's commission and a bearer of the silver oak leaf, was heard to scandalize the king's personage, his birthright, and his parentage, your majesty," he said. From the small knot of official witnesses, an almost inaudible sigh carried clearly to the 2 men on the throne platform. Duncan glanced up, looking for the source. It could have been Baron Arald, Lord of Castle Redmond, and ruler of the fief Holt was commissioned to serve. Or possibly Crowley, Commandant of the Ranger Corps. The 2 men were Holt's oldest friends. "Your Majesty," Anthony continued tentatively, "I remind you that, as a serving officer of the king, such comments are in direct contravention of the prisoner's oath of loyalty, and so constitute a charge of treasonous behaviour." Duncan looked to the chamberlain with a pained expression. The law was very clear on the matter of treasonous behaviour. There were only 2 possible punishments. "Oh, surely, Lord Anthony," he said, "a few angry words." Anthony's gaze was troubled now. He had hoped that the king wouldn't try to influence him in this matter. "Your Majesty, it's a contravention of the oath. It's not the words themselves that are the issue, but the fact that the prisoner broke his oath by saying them in public. The law is clear on the matter." He looked at Holt and spread his hands in a helpless gesture. A slight smile touched the ranger's battered features. "And you'd be breaking yours, Lord Anthony, by not informing the king so," Holt said. This time, Anthony didn't order him to remain silent. Unhappily, he nodded his agreement. Holt was right. He had created an intolerable situation for everyone with this ridiculous drunken behaviour. Duncan went to speak, hesitated, then started again. "Holt, surely there must be some misunderstanding here," he suggested, hoping that the ranger could somehow find a way out of the charge. Holt shrugged. "I can't deny the charges, Your Majesty," he said evenly. "I was heard to say some unpleasant things about you." And there was the other horn of the dilemma. Holt had made his appalling comments in public, in front of at least half a dozen witnesses. As a man and a friend, Duncan could, and certainly would, be willing to forgive him. But as a king, he must uphold the dignity of his office. "But why, Holt? Why do this to us all?" It was the ranger's turn to shrug now. His eyes dropped from the king's. He muttered something in a low voice that Duncan couldn't quite make out. "What did you say?" he asked, wishing for some way out of the corner he found himself in. Holt's eyes came up to meet his again. "Too much brandy spirit, Your Majesty," he said in a louder tone. Then, forcing a humourless grin, he added, "I never had much of a head for liquor. Perhaps you could add a charge of drunkenness as well, Lord Anthony." For once, Anthony's composure and sense of protocol was rattled. "Please, Holt," he began, about to plead with the ranger not to make light of the proceedings. Then he recovered himself and turned to the king. "Those are the charges, Your Majesty, admitted to by the prisoner." For a long moment, Duncan sat, unspeaking. He stared at the small figure in front of him, trying to see through the defiant expression in those eyes to find the reason behind Holt's actions. He knew the ranger was angry because he had been refused permission to try and rescue his apprentice. But Duncan truly believed that it was vital that Holt remain in Araluen until the situation with Foldar was resolved. With each day that passed, Morgarath's former lieutenant was becoming a greater danger, and Duncan wanted his best advisors around him to deal with the matter. And Holt was one of the very best. Duncan drummed his fingers on the wooden arm of the throne in frustration. It was unlike Holt to not be able to see the bigger picture. In all the years they had known each other, Holt had never put his own interests before those of the kingdom. Now, seemingly out of spite and anger, he had allowed alcohol to cloud his thinking and his judgment. He had publicly insulted the king, in front of witnesses, an action that could not be ignored, nor passed off as a few angry words between friends. Duncan looked at his old friend and adviser. Holt's eyes were cast down now. Perhaps if he would plead for mercy, claim some leniency for his past services to the crown, anything. "Holt," Duncan began before he realized it. The ranger's eyes came up to meet his, and Duncan made a helpless little interrogatory gesture with his hands. But Holt's eyes hardened even as they met the king's, and Duncan could tell there would be no plea for mercy there. The greying head shook slightly in refusal, and Duncan's heart sank even further. He tried one more time to bridge the gap that had grown between him and Holt. He forced a small, conciliatory smile to his face. "After all, Holt," he added in a reasonable tone, "it's not as if I don't understand exactly how you feel. My own daughter is with your apprentice. Do you think I wouldn't like to simply leave the kingdom to its own devices to go rescue her? There's a fairly major difference, Your Majesty. A king's daughter can expect to be treated a little better than a mere apprentice ranger. She's a valuable hostage, after all. Duncan sat back a little in his chair. The bitterness in Holt's tone was like a slap in the face. Worse, the king realized, Holt was right. Once the Scandians knew Cassandra's identity, she would be well treated while she waited to be ransomed. Sadly, he realized that his attempt at reconciliation had only widened the rift between them. Anthony broke the growing silence in the room. Unless the prisoner has anything to say in his own defense, he is adjudged guilty, he warned Holt. Holt's eyes remained on the king's, however, and once again there came that tiny negative movement of the head. Anthony hesitated, looking around the room at the other noblemen and officers gathered there, hoping that someone, anyone, might find something to say in Holt's defense. But of course, there was nothing. The chamberlain saw Baron Arald's heavy-set shoulders slump in despair, saw the pain on Crowley's face as the Ranger Commandant looked away from the scene unfolding before them all. "The prisoner is guilty, Your Majesty," said Anthony. "It remains for you to pass sentence." And this, Duncan knew, was the part of being king that they never prepared you for. There was the loyalty, the adulation, the power, and the ceremony. There was luxury and fine foods and wines, and the best clothes and horses and weapons. And then there were the moments when one paid for all of those things. Moments like this, when the law must be upheld, when tradition must be preserved, when the dignity and power of the office must be protected, even if, by doing so, he would destroy one of his most valued friends. "The law sets down only 2 possible punishments for treason, Your Majesty," Anthony was prompting again, knowing how Duncan was hating every minute of this. Yes, I know," Duncan muttered angrily, but not soon enough to stop Anthony in his next statement. "Death or banishment, nothing less," the chamberlain intoned solemnly. And, as he said the words, Duncan felt a small thrill of hope in his chest. "Those are the choices, Lord Anthony?" he asked mildly, wishing to be sure. Anthony nodded gravely. "There are no others. Death or banishment only, Your Majesty." Slowly, Duncan stood, taking the sword in his right hand. He held it out in front of him, grasping the scabbard in his right hand below the intricately carved and inlaid crosspiece. He felt a warm glow of satisfaction. He had asked Anthony twice to make sure that the chamberlain's exact words were heard by the witnesses in the throne room. "Halt," he said firmly, feeling every eye in the room upon him. "Former King's Ranger to the Redmont Fife, I hereby, as Lord of this realm of Araluen, declare you to be banished from all my lands and holdings." Again, there was that small intake of breath throughout the room, as the listeners felt the relief of knowing that the sentence was not to be death. Not, he realized, that any of those present would have expected it to be. But now came the part they weren't expecting. "You are forbidden, under pain of death, to set foot in this kingdom again." He hesitated, seeing now the sadness in Holt's eyes, the pain that the greying ranger could no longer hide. Then he completed his statement. "For the period of 1 year from this day." Instantly, there was uproar in the throne room. Lord Anthony started forward, the shock evident on his face. "Your Majesty, I must protest. You can't do this." Duncan kept his face solemn. Others in the room were not quite so controlled. Baron Arald's face, he saw, was creased in a broad smile, while Crowley was doing his best to hide a grin in the grey cowl of his ranger's cloak. Duncan noted with a grim sense of satisfaction that, for the first time this morning, Holt was somewhat startled by the turn of events, but not nearly so much as the loudly protesting Lord Anthony. The king looked at the chamberlain, his eyebrows raised in question. "Can't, Lord Anthony?" he queried with great dignity. Anthony hurriedly retracted the statement, realizing that it was not his part to issue orders to the king. "I mean, your majesty, banishment is, well, it's banishment," he concluded lamely. Duncan nodded gravely. "Quite so," he replied. "And, as you told me yourself, it's one of only 2 choices that I can make." "But, your majesty, banishment is... it's total, it's for life," Anthony protested. His face was red with embarrassment. He bore Holt no ill feeling. In fact, up until the ranger had been arrested for scandalizing the king's reputation, Anthony had felt a distinct admiration for him. But it was his job, after all, to advise the king on matters of law and propriety. "The law stipulates that specifically, does it?" Duncan asked now, and Anthony shook his head and made a helpless gesture with his hands, very nearly losing his grip on his staff of office in the process. "Well, not specifically, no. It doesn't need to. Banishment has always been for life. It's traditional," he added, finding the words he was looking for. "Exactly," he replied. "And tradition is not law." "But," Anthony began, then found himself wondering why he was protesting so much. Duncan had, after all, found a way to punish Holt, but at the same time to leaven that punishment with mercy. The king saw the hesitation and took the initiative. "The matter is settled. Banished prisoner for 12 months. You have 48 hours to leave the borders of Araluen." Duncan's gaze met Holt's one last time. The ranger's head inclined slightly, in a mark of respect and gratitude to his king. Duncan sighed. He had no idea why Holt had forced this situation upon them all. Perhaps, sometime after the next year had passed, he might find out. Suddenly, he felt a welling up of distaste for the whole matter. He shoved the scabbarded sword through his belt. "This matter is completed," he told those assembled. "This court is closed." He turned and left the throne room, exiting through a small anteroom on the left. Anthony surveyed those assembled and shrugged his shoulders. "The king has spoken," he said, his tone suggesting how overwhelmed he was by the whole thing. "The prisoner is banished for a 12-month. Escort, take him away." And so saying, he followed the king out of the throne room.